I'm really pleased you're all here tonight, if only because there's something happening in Minnesota tonight that I thought might keep you away. This being a New York City crowd, I assume that you've already all decided to vote Republican and you just didn't need to hear Senator McCain speak. The mention of McCain gives me an opportunity to say that he's really one of the good guys in my book. Really, there would have been no investigation, no independent investigation of 9/11 were it not for John McCain. He was really willing in the months after 9/11 to stand up to the Bush administration, to stand up in a way that no Democrat or Republican would, to demand that there be some sort of independent investigation of the attacks. That may not have been so much Senator McCain's desire for truth-telling as it was a desire for revenge against the Bush administration. He, it's amazing to remember now that in 2002, the worst-kept secret in Washington was that John McCain hated George Bush and hated a lot of the people who worked for him, most especially Karl Rove. And McCain, blamed Bush and Rove for the dirty tricks in 2000 that McCain believed had kept him from the Republican nomination then. Whatever you think of John McCain now and the way he's running his campaign now, there's a tremendous amount of admiration for an awful lot of the work he has done in Washington, including his insistence that there be an investigation of 9/11. And to an awful lot of folks in Washington, is a bit disquieting now and remarkable, really, that John McCain is depending on a lot of Karl Rove's acolytes to lead his current campaign for the White House. I was also delighted, of course, to see on the dais in Minneapolis yesterday your former mayor, Rudy Giuliani, with his usual, low-key, subtle speech. I think my publishers were very disappointed that my book, which was published in February, came just a couple of days after Rudy Giuliani had pulled out of the presidential race. Because I think my publishers believed the book would produce an awful lot of excitement if Giuliani were still in the race. The book, Rudy Giuliani plays a big role in this book, and my portrayal of him is not flattering. The 9/11 Commission really took a pass in evaluating the performance of the New York City government and Rudy Giuliani's performance in particular on 9/11. That has a lot to do with the fact that in the time period in which the 9/11 Commission was doing its work, there was probably no more popular political figure in this country than Rudy Giuliani. He was in many ways a very scary figure for the 9/11 Commission to take on, and so they didn't take him on. The staff of the 9/11 Commission prepared a long series of questions they thought that Giuliani should be asked in public testimony about why the city of New York was really so unprepared for what came on 9/11. You have to remember that you folks, the city of New York, had been attacked before 9/11 by terrorists. You've been attacked in 1993 by Muslim extremists, and what did they attack? They attacked the World Trade Center. And so why was it terribly surprising that 8 years later, Muslim extremists would return to New York City, the principal target in this country, and would choose to try once again to bring down the World Trade Center? That shouldn't have been a big surprise. Yet in those 8 years in which the Giuliani administration had been in power, the city had done remarkably little to prepare itself for what came, and the little they had done was obviously insufficient. And I must admit, I didn't really understand this until I got into the reporting on the book, but I still find it remarkable that after the 93 attacks on the World Trade Center, the city decided properly to build a $15 million emergency command post for the mayor and his top aides. And Giuliani's aides suggested that they put the command center in Brooklyn or Queens, which presumably be a much less likely terrorist target than a command center set up in Manhattan, the big terrorist target in the New York City area. Giuliani overrules them, and he decides he's going to put his emergency command post on the 23rd floor of a skyscraper in lower Manhattan. And where does he want to put this skyscraper command center? He decides to put it in the World Trade Center. And so what happened on the morning of 9/11 was really too predictable. The emergency command center had to be shut down almost immediately because there was a fear that the building in which it was placed, World Trade Center 7, might also come under attack. The Twin Towers were then on fire. So the emergency command post had to be evacuated because there was an emergency. And what was the result of that? Well, Rudy Giuliani didn't have any place to go, so he stayed on the street, producing the iconic, heroic image of Rudy Giuliani in the rubble of the World Trade Center, or leading the masses up from lower Manhattan to safety. It's irony built on irony with Rudy Giuliani. But again, the 9/11 Commission was scared of taking him on, and in the end, when they had their chance to ask him tough questions, they asked him almost no questions. At that point, Rudy's heroic status as the hero of 9/11 was preserved. I'm so awed to speak before the Bar Association that I prepared this long speech, which I've decided not to read to you in full because I'd prefer to move on to questions. So let me move on to this. Why was the Bush administration so wary of a 9/11 commission, of an independent investigation? Well, I believe it's because they really did have an awful lot to hide, an awful lot to worry about. All of the evidence we have gathered since 9/11 shows that in the spring and summer of 2001, the months before 9/11, the Bush White House, the Bush administration, had a tremendous amount of intelligence suggesting that something terrible was about to happen, that there was going to be a catastrophic terrorist attack, probably overseas, but nobody was ruling out the possibility that it would be in this country. In fact, I think it was common wisdom in the federal government, wisdom may be the wrong word, but it was a common understanding in the federal government that if Al-Qaeda was at work in this country, if terrorist networks were at work in this country, the FBI, which had responsibility for domestic terrorist threats, was so incompetent it wouldn't know about it. So the idea that somebody was waving off the suggestion of a domestic terrorist attack is kind of ludicrous. The CIA, we know, George Tenet, the former director of the CIA, has an awful lot to answer for in history. But I think the record does show that in the spring and summer of 2001, he really did bang on the doors at the White House saying, the intelligence we're receiving is as bad as we've ever had. We believe there's going to be a big terrorist attack someplace in the world. And again, we're not ruling out the possibility that it will be in this country. This is the sort of information, obviously, the Bush administration was not terrifically eager after 9/11 to have anybody investigate, which I think explains a lot about why they really went all out to try to prevent the creation of the commission in the first place. If you don't mind me digressing a bit and bragging a bit, I'll tell you that my book ended up on the bestsellers list on the Times the same week that the New York Times announced that it had it was announcing an early retirement plan for veteran employees. And I figured the fact that I got the bestseller ranking the same week as the buyout offer was offered was some sort of sign from God. And obviously things are not great in the newspaper business these days, so I took the buyout and I left. And it has given me a little freedom. When you work at the Times, when you go out in the speaking world, you go out to speaking engagements, you're always told by editors, don't express your opinions, just the facts. But I'll tell you now that I'm free of those restrictions, it is very clear to me, based on what I think is fact, that 9/11 just didn't have to happen. That there were a tremendous number of clues out there in the months before 9/11 that something terrible was about to happen and that it might well happen in this country. The best evidence, the best example of that is the fact that on 9/11, there was a guy sitting in a jail cell in Minnesota by the name of Zacarias Moussaoui, who would later found to be a 9/11 conspirator. And FBI agents who took Moussaoui into custody in Minneapolis at a flight school, where he had apparently asked to learn how to fly a 747, even though he had very limited knowledge of how to pilot any sort of plane. The FBI agents in Minnesota were convinced that this guy was a terrorist, and that he was a terrorist who was going to be involved in some sort of hijacking plot. And there's a really chilling document out of FBI files where an FBI supervisor in Minneapolis calls Washington and says, listen, this is August 2001, just a few weeks before the attacks, and says, listen, I think this guy might crash a plane into the World Trade Center. The FBI, which takes a real tough review in my book, the FBI supervisors in Washington just couldn't be bothered with any of this and just buried the warnings they were getting from Minneapolis about Moussaoui. The CIA, we later learned, also had information suggesting that two al-Qaeda terrorists had entered the United States in 2000. They had known this for months and months before 9/11 and apparently didn't bother to share this information with anybody, including the FBI. There was an FBI agent in Phoenix who 3 months before 9/11 sent a memo to Washington saying that it seemed to him that there needed to be an urgent nationwide investigation of why so many young Arab men were seeking commercial flight training in this country. Was there some sort of terrorist connection? And again, apparently at FBI headquarters in Washington, nobody could be bothered even to read this memo. So these are big dots that were out there before 9/11, and it seems to me that it should not have been so difficult to connect them. That if the federal officials in Washington had been on the ball, none of this ever had to happen. And just imagine how different the world would be right now if we had gone without. I really am trying to abbreviate here, so give me a minute. In December 2002, I got a tap on my shoulder from my editor in the Washington Bureau, suggesting that I consider taking on a new assignment. And that's always something to be wary of at the New York Times when an editor taps you on the shoulder and suggests you consider a new assignment. But he wanted me to consider covering the newly created 9/11 Commission, which was then known as, a lot of people are calling the Kissinger Commission, because it was then being run by Henry Kissinger, who was President Bush's choice to lead the investigation. And it seems callous and a little crazy to remember this, but I didn't want the job. It sounded like a bad assignment. I think there was an assumption in Washington that a lot of the central mysteries, this again is December 2002, a lot of the central mysteries of 9/11 had already been figured out, that yes, there had been some warnings ahead of time, and that yes, bureaucratic incompetence explained why all of the evidence had been ignored before 9/11. But the editor in Washington was persistent, and I finished up covering the 9/11 Commission for a couple of years. And it turned out to be one of the best assignments of my career. One of the satisfactions of the job, obviously, is that everything involved in the 9/11 Commission was somehow tied to sort of the key event of our nation's modern history, a key event in the lives of many of us and our loved ones. It had a terrific cast of characters to cover, everybody from George Bush to Condoleezza Rice to Osama bin Laden, to a man whose name we really didn't know in 2002, but who would become pretty famous later on by the name of Richard Clarke. And Richard Clarke, you may recall, became one of the great Washington whistleblowers in 2004 when he went public in a book and on 60 Minutes to announce that while he'd been at the White House in 2001, Condoleezza Rice and George Bush had ignored most of the evidence in front of them about an imminent terrorist attack. And Clarke seemed to know what he was talking about when we finally did hear from him. He'd been the counterterrorism advisor in the Clinton administration and went on to do the same job in the Bush administration. It was a great detective story. It turned out that while congressional investigators who'd previously investigated 9/11 had done a good job, there were many mysteries they hadn't resolved. It was the 9/11 Commission that figured out how the Pentagon and the FBI had essentially made up a phony chronology of their actions on the morning of 9/11, apparently to mask their utter incompetence. It was the 9/11 Commission that figured out that John Ashcroft, then the Attorney General, had apparently also ignored all the evidence sitting in front of him. He was apparently so bored by the subject of al-Qaeda and terrorist threats that he told the FBI in June 2001, 3 months before the attacks, that he didn't want to hear anything more about al-Qaeda, that he felt there was nothing he could do about it, so he felt it wasn't necessary for him to even hear the words used. And of course, it was the 9/11 Commission that forced the White House, at threat of a subpoena, to turn over some extraordinary documents that are known as the President's Daily Briefs. And the PDB is sort of the super secret newspaper that's given to President Bush and Vice President Cheney every morning, that's sort of in which the CIA outlines the sort of the hottest information, the most important information it's received overnight about national security threats around the world. And it turned out that one of those presidential daily briefs, the one given to George Bush on August 6, 2001, just 3 weeks before the attacks, about a month before the attacks, had a stark headline: Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. It's possible to make too much of the August 6 PDB, which was sort of the most important document uncovered by the 9/11 Commission. But I would urge you, if you have a chance, to find a copy. You can find it easily on the internet. It's only a couple of pages long, and it includes reporting on suspicions that there were ongoing threats from al-Qaeda involving hijackings, domestic hijackings, and that there was evidence that terrorist suspects had recently conducted surveillance of tall buildings in New York City. So why should it have been so difficult? Hijackings, tall buildings in New York City, ongoing al-Qaeda threats, 70 FBI investigations of possible domestic strikes. Why should it have been difficult for anybody in the White House or anywhere else in the federal government to connect a few of those dots? I thought while I was covering the commission in 2002 through 2004, I thought I was doing a pretty good job. And I think a lot of the reporting we had at the Times kind of led the way for the National Press Corps in covering the commission. I had a lot of access to the 9/11 commissioners, the 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats who were supposedly making all the calls on the commission. I had almost instant access to most of them. They certainly weren't frightened of reporters. And when the commission went out of business in 2004, you'll recall that the 9/11 Commission report was sort of hailed as a masterwork. Not only did it seem to have gotten to the details of the 9/11 plot and how the government had mishandled the information it was provided, it was also, arguably the most beautifully written government report of our times. It worked as literature as much as any government document I've ever read. And it seemed to prove a very important point, certainly in Washington, that very partisan Democrats and very partisan Republicans could come together in agreement on sort of the essential national security issues facing us. It was unanimous. And to this day, it remains the definitive account on a lot of what happened on September 11th, 2001. But after the commission went out of business, I was a little chagrined to discover I hadn't done my job as well as I thought I had. It turned out, well, certainly I knew while the commission was in business that I couldn't talk to the staff of the 9/11 Commission. It's a polite fiction in Washington that blue ribbon commissioners, the members of blue ribbon commissions, write their own reports. That's almost never the case. Usually they're written by a staff of researchers or congressional researchers, mostly young people, who do most of the digging and do most of the writing. And the commissioners usually sign off on what has been developed by their staffs. But those people, the real investigators, the real diggers, weren't available to me during the course of my reporting on the commission. They had been ordered by their boss, a fellow by the name of Philip Zelikow, a very prominent historian at the University of Virginia, not to talk to reporters. At risk of their jobs, they were told if they talked to a reporter, that was a fireable offense. It turned out that Zelikow had also issued an order to them not to return calls from the 10 commissioners, that he, Dr. Zelikow, would control the flow of information on the commission. I also learned an awful lot after the commission went out of business about Dr. Zelikow. It had been known while he was running the investigation as executive director, which sort of gave him control of the day-to-day commission investigation, that he was very close to many people in the Bush White House. Most importantly, Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, who was at the heart of everything the 9/11 Commission was supposed to be investigating. Zelikow had written a book with Rice. They had served together in the National Security Council in the White House in the presidency of Bush 41, and they had maintained a close friendship in the presidency of Bush 43. And I say we knew that about Zelikow, but it turned out there was much more about Zelikow's ties to the White House, that while he was running the 9/11 Commission, he was maintaining some sort of contact with Karl Rove. Now, anytime you hear Karl Rove's name in Washington, you know, the conversation stops, and with good reason. So when I began working on this book and learned that Zelikow had been on the phone with Karl Rove, and that he had apparently at one point ordered his secretary to stop keeping a logbook of his calls to the White House and to Karl Rove, I thought, I'm learning things about the 9/11 Commission I didn't know before, and things that I think would rewrite the history of the Commission and its work. There were other things I learned over the course of the work on the book that I hadn't known before and that were pretty alarming. It turned out the 9/11 Commission had missed an awful lot of evidence. Most importantly, the 9/11 Commission never completely reviewed apparently pretty much ignored the terrorism archives maintained by the National Security Agency, the big eavesdropping agency. The NSA, we've learned an awful lot about in the last couple of years, since apparently it's been conducting domestic surveillance of some of us, that the NSA is the source of most of the raw material in the federal government about terrorist threats, through spy satellites, through eavesdropping equipment, through telephone networks. It gathers the raw material that the CIA analyzes on terrorist threats. When you read when a CIA analyst prepares a report about terrorist threats, often that's written largely on the basis of what the NSA has learned. Well, it turned out, I learned over the course of work on this book, that the 9/11 Commission apparently had ignored what was in the archives of the NSA, that nobody had bothered to drive the 70 miles from Washington to Fort Meade, Maryland, where the NSA is based, to go through their material. When they realized, to their horror, at the last minute, in the final weeks of the investigation, they haven't done that. They have a frantic field trip up to Fort Meade on a weekend to try to go through these mountains of archives on terrorist threats. And when they do, they find, to their horror, that there's some really juicy stuff in here that they've missed. Most importantly, they discovered that apparently, even though the Bush administration had fixated over the course of years about the possible connections between Al-Qaeda and Iraq, actually, there might have been a much closer connection between Al-Qaeda and Iran, and that some of the 9/11 hijackers had actually passed through Iran in the months before the hijackings and been given special dispensation by the Iranian government to do that. So, 9/11 Commission staffers at the last minute, forced some of this material into the 9/11 Commission report, but they realize, again to their horror, that there is so much else at the NSA they've never bothered to review that remains unreviewed to this day. And I would think that, and I understand that there are people on Capitol Hill who believe that there may be an effort in the new Congress to get back, have somebody go back into the NSA and start reviewing some of this material. I think I also learned over the course of this something that I kind of knew before, but really know now as a result of the book, which is that lobbying really works. And I think if you talk to the commissioners on the 9/11 Commission, if you talk to the staff, they would tell you that if one agency of government failed above all others, it was the FBI. Yet it turns out, as I detail in the book, that the director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, mounted such a phenomenal behind-the-scenes lobbying campaign with the commissioners that he won them over. He was in their faces, literally. He would take them to breakfast, lunch, or dinner. He would meet them at the airport. He would drive across town. He would do whatever they wanted to try to convince them to leave the FBI alone. And at the end of the day, the 9/11 Commission pretty much gave the FBI a pass. It focused most of its criticism on the CIA and on George Tenet, even though, again, I think it's a common understanding that if you want to measure broken agencies, the FBI is, or was, the far more broken agency than the CIA. As a result of this book, I have many fewer friends in Washington. I think I treat most of the 9/11 commissioners to very flattering profiles. And I think anybody who meets the chairman of the 9/11 Commission, Tom Kean, the former governor of New Jersey, would tell you that this man should have finished up in the White House. He is just a tremendous public servant. But clearly many of the commissioners, after reading my book, believe that, I think they believed this before they read the book, that anything that tarnishes the 9/11 tarnishes their individual legacies. And so therefore they don't like the book. But that's fine. That's the price you pay for journalism. I think I've learned through this book that daily journalism really has its value, but that it's not enough. As I say, I am surprised how much I missed in the course of covering the commission diligently for the New York Times for a couple of years. But no matter how hard you try to tell a story as a daily reporter, there are details that can only really be known after the passage of some time and with the opportunity to do digging of a sort you can't do when you're on a daily deadline. And unfortunately, daily newspapers, and even the best of them, aren't able to look back very well. Luckily, the publishing industry, as it turns out, offers a venue for this, and I think that with all the troubles in the newspaper business, you'll see more and more of us hacks turn to books or to blogs or even to Hollywood. So I'm not so distressed about what's happening to the journalism business as a lot of others. I just think we're all looking for new venues to practice our trade. I believe in the audience there are a good number of people who believe I missed a lot in my book. Specifically, that I missed a lot about the question of whether or not 9/11 was an inside job. And maybe I'll begin that conversation, if indeed those folks are in the audience, with a statement that I do have trouble believing that people within the government ordered 9/11 to happen. I can believe that there was sort of a malign neglect, that people had a sense that something terrible was happening and they didn't act on it. Although my temptation would be to believe that they didn't act on it because in many cases they were lazy. It was August. It was hot in Washington. People were going on summer vacation. And it looked like if something was going to happen, it was going to probably happen overseas. And those people, I believe, should have been disciplined or even fired as a result of their inaction. I think one of the remarkable facts about 9/11 is that almost 7 years later, no one, not one person, was ever disciplined or fired for what went so wrong. And many people were promoted. Condoleezza Rice, who has as much to answer for as anybody in the Bush administration for 9/11, she was the gatekeeper on intelligence and national security issues in the weeks before 9/11. She obviously got promoted. She became the Secretary of State of the United States, and one of her first acts when she arrived at the State Department was to choose her counselor, sort of an all-purpose aide who would handle all sorts of international issues and would be at her side at all times. And she chose a gentleman by the name of Philip Zelikow, who'd recently stepped down from the 9/11 Commission. I've also learned, as a result of my experiences on this book, which have been terrific, and the book tour, that I get a little tired of my own voice after a while, and I find I get terrific questions wherever I go. And if we are able to do that, it'd be terrific to take a few questions.
Saying that there were a lot of things you didn't pick up when you were reporting on the Commission's activities. Did you have access to information over and above what was made public by the Commission, or your access to the Commissioners? Because most of the information you pick up later wasn't available.
No, believe me,
I don't think in my career at the Times, and I was there for 26, 27 years, I don't think I've ever worked so hard on a story. And believe me, if I knew something, I wanted to get it on the front page of the New York Times the next day. And no, I wasn't holding anything back. I think the one thing I did hold back, or at least I wasn't aggressive enough over time, is the stuff about Zelikow. I had a sense that his conflicts were much larger than I originally knew about, but I didn't take that on as the investigative project I perhaps should have. But, I'm sorry, yes, please.
There's a lot of points that you covered. I just was wondering, when the Commission was reviewing everything they had to review, and you were covering the story, and I didn't read the published report. Did they actually read the public comments? Because they had set up a website to solicit tips and suggestions from the general public. And in fact, I had sent one in, I don't know, I guess it vanished into a black hole. They also had available to them foreign intelligence and published materials such as foreign newspaper reports or things that had surfaced around the world. And I somehow think that when you're investigating a tremendous security failure, it's not just like whether the FBI picked up something, or the CIA, or the NSA, or even the FAA domestically. Because, for example, and I think this was one of the things that I had sent in, which I don't know whether it got into a footnote or what, but in 1992, I believe, in France, not just a hijacking, but in terms of methodology, to use an airplane as a weapon, as a guided missile.
right.
And then
That's in the report.
But was it ignored? Did the CIA and the NSA, knowing this had happened in France, think, oh, it happened over there, it can't possibly happen here? Because when
I think the answer to that,
The CIA, the intelligence committee, the gentleman is referring to apparently some Algerian hijackers, I think, hijacked an Air France plane and were preparing to have it plunge into the Eiffel Tower.
they were going to attack Paris.
Right. So the idea that nobody could have imagined this, that nobody could have imagined using a hijacked commercial plane as a terrorist weapon is not true, because there had been other instances of it in the past. And I think the answer is the CIA was aware of it. They had put it in various intelligence reports over the year, as did the FAA. But nobody, it had been years earlier, and nobody had focused on it properly.
Did Rice actually say that no one could have imagined or foreseen that could happen?
Yeah, there was a remarkable statement she made in which she said, who could have, this is, I believe, like 8 months after 9/11, and at a White House briefing, her quote was something like, I don't think anybody could have imagined anybody hijacking a plane and slamming it into the World Trade Center, and I don't think anybody could have imagined hijacking a plane and slamming it into the Pentagon, when in fact there had been a number of reports to just that effect.
Scowcroft, who was her mentor, was also interviewed at the time for television, and I remember reading the transcript, and it was some of the same.
again, I think this gets to the larger point, which my belief, I certainly believe that 9/11
could have been prevented. There were tremendous dots out there, and you're pointing to another dot that existed out there, a piece of information that should have suggested that, yeah, someday somebody's going to try to hijack a plane and they're going to try to push it into a prominent landmark in the United States. Sir. Yes, my cameraman.
The book talks about his paper in Foreign Affairs Quarterly.
Right.
He had a catastrophic terrorism, but the Aspen seminar in April that led to that report had a more revealing title, Catastrophic Terrorism, Elements of a National Policy.
Mhm.
And further, in the internet, I don't know if Zelikow describes himself or other people do as the creator and maintenance of public myths.
Right. Again, Zelikow is almost uniformly described as brilliant. And a lot of people, and including a lot of Democrats, have real respect for him. Certainly everybody respects his brain power. There's a quote in the book from Henry Kissinger who tells Tom Kean, the chairman, that Zelikow is one of the most brilliant men I know, but you will not like him, nobody does. He's a very, very abrasive fellow. But no, he, among his specialties is terrorism, and he had actually written this really, he's written a couple of them, the gentleman points out, really remarkable documents in which he talked about the potential for, or what would happen after a catastrophic terrorist attack. And he suggested that if and when it happened, there would be great restrictions on civil liberties. There would be a new form of governance in this country, and he was right about an awful lot of that. This has led to the theories that Zelikow was somehow part of the conspiracy, that he was the guy sent into the investigation to cover up, that somehow the administration had some hand in 9/11 and he was going to prevent that hand from being shown. As I say, I have trouble personally believing that, but there are certainly many people who want to believe that. Gentleman in the back.
You brought up the Moussaoui trial, and during that point, there was quite a lot of reporting, I believe in the New York Times, on the incredible amount of attempts by FBI field agents, Cully Rowley, Harry Samet, who wrote 70 memos to the superiors and headquarters there about Moussaoui, and great detail. 70 memos were ignored, and one was even altered.
Right. But again, this doesn't strike. I mean, that story is so amazing, which is that.
Abbreviate it, which is that, so this quite loony fellow named Zacharias Moussaoui shows up in Eagan, Minnesota at a flight school and says he wants to learn in a hurry how to fly. Really, that's what he says. He wants to learn quickly how to fly a 747.
Do you want to learn how to land or just take off?
Well, that's in question exactly what he said. But he wanted in a hurry, like within weeks, to find out how to fly a 747. And the instructor at the flight school takes one look at him. This guy's a former pilot for Northwest Airlines, takes one look at him, literally one look, and says, this guy's a terrorist. And he goes that same day, within hours, to the leader, the head of the flight school, and says, we got to call the FBI. We got to get this guy taken care of. So they call the FBI. They do all the right things. The FBI agents in Minneapolis, God bless them, they take one look at Moussaoui and they say, this guy's a terrorist. And he wants to learn how to fly a 747. I guess he wants to conduct some sort of terrorist attack involving a large commercial plane. And again, the FBI agents in Minneapolis are convinced they have a terrorist who wants to learn quickly how to fly a big plane, probably into a building someplace. Yet nobody in Washington will give them the time of day. In Minneapolis, they want permission to get the warrant needed to go through Moussaoui's laptop computer, which has some of the details involving the 9/11 plot, the conspiracy. Yet Washington turns them down. Says, we don't see much here, just deport the guy. And again, you can imagine what the heartache of these agents when they discover on 9/11 what has just happened. Because they're convinced that Moussaoui, they know that instant that Moussaoui was part of what had just happened. And it's only the FBI demonstrating such a lack of competence. It's only on the afternoon of September 11th that the acting director of the FBI is even told that this fellow, Zacharias Moussaoui, exists. He's told it by a sheepish supervisor during a conference call for the guy in Minnesota. Says, are you aware of the fact that we have this fellow sitting here and that we're all convinced he's a terrorist who was involved in just this sort of plot? Sir?
Am I wrong in recalling that the Minnesota incident that you just elaborated on and two other dots that weren't connected that you mentioned very early in your remarks, that all of that stuff has been out there for some time, because nothing you said in that part of your remarks struck me as new. So what other things like that did the commission not find out about that you since...
What does the commission not find out about, or what did they find out about?
Or not report, maybe found out?
Well, I mean, I think I give credit to the 9/11 Commission for having dug up a lot. I don't think they presented it well, and they didn't present it sort of in an authoritative sense, but they dug up a lot of material to show just how often and how urgently the intelligence community was telling the White House that a terrorist attack was about to take place. I'll try to find it as we speak here, but there's a long list of detailed warnings that were given to Condoleezza Rice in particular about the need to organize, to prepare the law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies for an imminent attack. And again, she apparently just brushed off most of those warnings.
What is it that are there things that they missed?
Well, actually, I'll tell you on this point in particular, which is that, let's recall that Dr. Zelikow is very close to Condoleezza Rice. He insisted that when the commission could detail all the warnings, the intelligence warnings given to the White House, but it had to be done in a balanced fashion. So in other words, you could say that Richard Clarke says that he repeatedly told President Bush and Condoleezza Rice about these threats, but that would have to be followed in the next sentence with, but Condoleezza Rice says she acted appropriately and quickly on these reports. So it's sort of, Clarke says this, Rice says this, Clarke says this, Rice says this, and dear reader, we're not going to tell you who's telling the truth. When in fact the staff of the 9/11 Commission was very much convinced that it was Richard Clarke who was telling the truth, and that Condoleezza Rice really had blown off the warnings that were given to her. Condoleezza Rice, I will say I hadn't understood until I got into the weeds of the reporting on this book how much lands at the front door of Condoleezza Rice, because President Bush was not given a lot of this information. It often stopped at her door. She was the gatekeeper of information about national security information, and a lot of this information, specifically the information from Dick Clarke, wasn't getting to the Oval Office, wasn't getting to the president. And one more thought about Dr. Zelikow. It also turned out, we found out very late in the game on the 9/11 Commission, that Zelikow had worked on the 2001 transition team for President Bush as the transition team's advisor on counterterrorism issues at the National Security Council, Dick Clarke's operation. And that it was Philip Zelikow who had essentially urged that Dick Clarke be demoted, that he be barred from having easy access to the Oval Office. Richard Clarke had been President Clinton's counterterrorism advisor and had very easy access to the White House. He could essentially go in and see the president whenever he thought there was an urgent threat that needed to be acted on. At Zelikow's urging in 2001, Dick Clarke suddenly finds himself blocked from access to the Oval Office. He couldn't get to the president to tell him that there was a big threat that needed to be acted on. So the guy who's running the investigation of 9/11 is the guy who put in place the machinery at the White House in 2001 that prevented the National Security Council from really doing its job on terrorism. I'm sorry, let me move around. I'm sorry, I didn't get you.
You mentioned before about how beautifully written the 9/11 Commission report was. And I remember it.
By government standards.
Well, but I actually think you're probably underestimating that. The first, that introductory, and I confess I didn't read every single word of the whole thing because for the reason I'm about to say, but that introductory paragraph was really very much like a made-for-television movie. I mean, it was clearly, pardon me?
A lot of it reads like a sort of fast-paced thriller.
It was clearly designed to create, to stimulate emotional response and sense of patriotism and everything else. Without going into that point, my question was whether you were saying about how hard it was that you had access to Tom Kean, Rudy Hamilton, those kind of people. Did you ever eventually get to talk to the grunts you know, the little Princeton graduates who actually wrote the
Oh,
thing.
I'm sorry, no, maybe I didn't make that clear in the comment. Yeah, what happened after the commission went out of business was,
Well, yeah, and then, you know,
is that as a reporter, suddenly I had access to these people. They didn't have to opt.
Zelikow's rules anymore, and a lot of them had these terrific, fascinating stories to tell, both about the detective work they did in trying to get to information on the commission, and also, and even more fascinating to me, these incredible battles that were going on between the commission and the White House, and these battles within the commission itself, specifically the battles between Zelikow and the staff.
Just one short thought. Did you have any sense of sort of how the thing was written the way it was? Because to be honest, it seemed to be sort of transparently made to get the average American to read the first 50 pages, get a great, you know, swell of patriotism in their chest, and put it down and not read the rest of it.
Patriotism angle, but I do know that that Zelikow consulted a prominent historian at Harvard by the name of Ernest May, and that they had sat down at the very beginning of the process and said, how do we write a government report that the public's actually going to read and not just put on a bookshelf and ignore? And they really came up with the idea. And Tom Kean, who has his own roots as an historian, was eager to try to write a government report that would actually be read by his family and his grandchildren. And obviously they succeeded in many ways.
It was really a conspiracy by Karl Rove to write something.
You know, I wish I could tell you what went on in those conversations between Zelikow and Rove.
That
And
was the question. Did you get it?
yeah, I can't tell you what went on. I can tell you that Zelikow and Rove insist that their conversations strictly involve Zelikow's old work as an historian at the University of Virginia. But the idea that Zelikow and Rove are talking a lot, or at least 4 times we know according to the telephone logs, and that Zelikow, after it becomes unknown on the staff that he's having these conversations, that he calls in his secretary, shuts the door, and orders her no longer to keep phone logs of his conversations with the White House. I would think there may be more to those conversations than we know about. Please. Oh, do you mind? I'll come right next. Well, you're next. How about that?
I was wondering, who was it that pushed Zelikow for the job to begin with? And I know you mentioned the part that I think it was Kerrey who was objecting to the idea that he was going to be part of it. But who was it that like pushed him in there? And do you know also, like, what other kind of gatekeeping things effects did he have other than trying to cover his and Condi's asses? Was there other stuff that he kept out?
Let me take the last question first. Well, I think, you know, he was the editor of this report, and he was, in many ways, the principal author of the 9/11 Commission report. And he writes well, so the fact that it's well written has a lot to do with the fact that Philip Zelikow was the principal writer and editor of this thing. One thing we do know, I know for a fact he kept out, and it's documented in the book, is that there was going to be in the report one pretty critical comment about President George Bush. And it was going to be a mention of the fact that in all of his public comments before 9/11, both on the campaign trail in 2000 and in the White House in 2001, Bush almost never talked about terrorist threats. It just didn't seem to be an issue that interested him. And that by comparison, Bill Clinton talked often and urgently about terrorism as the principal threat to this generation. And Zelikow insisted that all of that come out. And it was all taken out over the objections of the staff. And the staffer who had written that material is so alarmed by this that she quietly and secretly writes it into the footnotes, because she knows that Zelikow's not paying attention to the footnotes. The first part of your question was?
Who pushed him?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, there were plenty of conspiracy theories about Zelikow was was a White House mole. They planted him there. I don't think that's the case. He was recommended by one of the Republican members of the commission, former Senator Slade Gordon of Washington, who comes off, I say, is a very flattering portrayal of him in the book. He knew Zelikow from another commission on electoral reform. He was very impressed by him. And again, Zelikow was a brilliant guy, or at least perceived as brilliant by most people, and suggests he be hired on. Kean and Hamilton look at Zelikow's resume, see some problems about a conflict of interest, his problems with Condi Rice and the rest, his ties to Condi Rice, but they think that he's so head and shoulders above all others as the potential executive director. They'll look past that to give him that job. I'm sorry, Bob Kerrey, who lives just down the street here, the former senator from Nebraska, joins the commission about halfway through. On the first day he's got the job, he goes down to Washington and starts reviewing all the classified information. He finds in the files a memo that Zelikow has prepared listing all of his conflicts of interest, his ties to the Bush administration. Apparently, Bob Kerrey picks up the phone to Tom Kean and says, "It's him or me. Either Zelikow goes or I go. How could you possibly have picked somebody to run this thing with as many conflicts of interest as Philip Zelikow?" Kean is such a good politician that he keeps Kerrey on the commission's members. And I'm sorry, sir.
Yeah, my apologies, Rachel, but could you give us a tiny bit more about the intricacies of Giuliani's decision and your sort of sources for where that came from to have the command center located there? And also, I was wondering what particular other criticism or how you framed it that you have in the store had Giuliani not been eliminated. What would you have said, or was there any kind of extra things you'd have hit on?
I'm sure.
The story about the command post, some of that has been out there. I think I got to the staff members on the commission who'd actually investigated what had happened with the command center and why it had been placed in the World Trade Center, all the rest of it. And they gave me all the details of that story.
What I meant was sort of you gave more into the list of questions that they wanted Giuliani to ask sort of testing. What was sort of great how asked the questions they...
Why didn't you do much more? The city had been attacked by, again, it is really remarkable. The city of New York had been attacked by Muslim extremists in 1993, and they targeted the World Trade Center. They wanted to bring down the World Trade Center with a bomb. It didn't work. Why was it terribly surprising that 8 years later, they might try again? And why in those 8 years had so little been done to prepare the city? You know, one thing that became a big issue here was the fact that the emergency radio system used by the fire department didn't work. And they had known in 1993 that they wouldn't work given the width of the walls, or I can't remember exactly. But they knew that the radio systems used by the fire department in 1993 didn't work at the World Trade Center site. And in 2001, 8 years later, September 11th, they didn't work again. And so the fire, hundreds of, I believe it's hundreds, yeah, I think it's 300 firefighters in the World Trade Center, because their radios didn't work properly, didn't hear the evacuation order to get out, and therefore died.
Was there any evidence Giuliani was aware of this? Did it get to no level that...
Yes, I think he was aware of the problem with the radios. He was aware of the problems with the radios, and he said he had an explanation, which is that there wasn't adequate technology out there, and I think people would quibble with that. Oh, please. You? Oh, he's asked a question. Your turn.
To what extent does the FBI offer up political correctness as a defense to their actions? We don't want to be targeting Muslim men because
They have
it's racial.
They don't even bother in this case.
I think in the case of Moussaoui, their argument is that, and again, it's just a complete mess up. They thought that because the intelligence files showed Moussaoui was tied to a Chechnyan quasi-terrorist group, that wasn't sufficient justification to link Moussaoui to terrorism and on, and so therefore deport him rather than investigate him. But that, you know, the argument was later shown to be so absurd that very few people who understand the facts defend the FBI's performance. And Bob Mueller wasn't defending the FBI's performance. He was just saying, I'm new, give me a chance to try to figure things out and make things right. And again, it makes such a difference in Washington when somebody at the level of the FBI director is in your face every day pleading for your help to give him time to make the reforms that he says are needed.
Could you contrast the 9/11 Commission to the Pearl Harbor Commission? I believe the admirals in charge of Pearl Harbor were immediately stripped of.
Yeah, there was accountability. You know, one thing, the 9/11 Commission, Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton in particular, felt that if they got into the business of personal accountability, you know, who really bungled intelligence before 9/11, they would never have a unanimous report, and so they gave up on the concept of personal accountability. There had been personal accountability in previous government investigations, including the Pearl Harbor investigations. In the Pearl Harbor investigations, the the top Navy man, the top Army man at Pearl Harbor were stripped of their commands very shortly after the investigation. I believe it was even before the investigations were completed. There was some level of accountability there.
Weren't they possibly restored?
I believe it was seen later that they had been to some degree scapegoated. I think there's, historians still debate
Is
that.
that part of Kean's calculus?
I don't hear that used. It was much more.
There was an application to have them restored and it was rejected about 2 years ago.
She knows more than I do. No, I think it was much more. Tom Kean, who had a reputation in New Jersey of being a guy who could always reach across the aisle to Democrats, he wanted to prove that bipartisanship could exist again in the government. And he saw his vehicle for that as the 9/11 Commission. And he thought, and Lee Hamilton, the number 2, agreed with him very much, that if they got in the business of finger pointing, it would be endless and they would never be able to get unanimity among the 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans on the commission.
Just on that, the upshot, as I remember it, was that they turned the whole thing into a reformist, like we need more money, we need better computers, the FBI has an obsolete computer system, we need something searchable, and also, let's break down the barriers between the different agencies so that they'll start talking to each other and sharing information. So there was just like a whole thing of let's move beyond and get more money and that'll solve all the problems.
The principal accomplishment, if you will, if that's
Of the 9/11 Commission was that it caused the creation of the job of Director of National Intelligence. The idea that there's sort of this super spy who organizes all of the intelligence agencies in the government, including the CIA. But I think there's a lot of debate about whether or not that was much of a reform and whether or not that's just added another layer of bureaucracy to the layer cake.
And the Department of Homeland Security.
Right,
The euphemistically named agent.
right.
What is Philip Zelikow's current gig, and did he ever do an interview at any stage of the game?
he is back at the University of Virginia. He left the doctor.
His employ a couple of years ago. He declined to give me a face-to-face interview. But he offered a compromise, which is that he said he would answer any question I offered him in writing by email. And it turned out to be a terrific way of doing business, because I would send him a list of questions, and he would and to his credit, he would very quickly get back to me with long, often quite detailed answers. And this went on for months and months and months. And as a result, all 130 pages of it are available on the book's website. So you can read exactly what Philip Zelikow has to say for himself, and you can make your own judgment as to whether or not I treat him fairly. And I think he knew that's where this was all heading. He knew that the book might treat him harshly and that he wanted a record created of what he had said. Also making those 130 pages available to you if you call him up.